Greetings from Boston. My name is Mustafa Sahin. I'm a child neurologist working here at Boston Children's Hospital and Harvard Medical School. And I'd like to share with you today the results of a clinical trial that we completed in PTEN hamartoma tumor syndrome patients with a drug called Everolimus. I'm going to share some slides with you. So this is a three-center trial that was performed in the United States at Boston Children's, Cleveland Clinic, and Stanford University. And we used a compound called Everolimus, which is an mTOR inhibitor. And mTOR is shown on this slide downstream of PTEN, as shown here. This is the mTOR pathway as we understand it today. And what happens when you don't have PTEN activity, as in the individuals that are missing PTEN function, is that the mTOR kinase, it's a protein in the cell, becomes hyperactive, and that results in increased protein synthesis and cell growth. That is, we believe, responsible for the symptoms in PHTS. So the idea here is that if PTEN is not functioning well, then we have to inhibit the function of the mTOR pathway. And this idea has been around for a while. And the inhibitors of this molecule P10 were first identified as a natural compound on an island on Easter Island here in the Pacific Ocean. Many, many years ago, the compound called rapamycin is a natural compound, as I mentioned here, as shown here. And it was shown to be an antifungal first. It turns out that it doesn't work on fungus as well as one would hope, but it does seem to have a mild immunosuppressive capabilities. And then people finally figured out that it inhibits the mTOR enzyme, and it was approved for use in certain kinds of cancer, such as renal cell carcinoma. But really, the role of mTOR was not identified in the nervous system until the connection between mTOR and another disease called tuberous sclerosis became obvious around 2002. And since then, rapamycin-like compounds have been tested in many animal models of human neurological diseases, such as tuberous sclerosis, as well as PHTS, and they have shown significant efficacy in those models. I should say the compound we use called Everolimus is a synthetic compound where the drug company Novartis just added one methyl group on top of the natural compound. It's very, very similar to rapamycin, and it works almost exactly the same way. So the primary objective of our study was to test if this drug is safe in patients with PTEN mutations. And our secondary objectives was to see if this was effective in improving neurocognition and behavior in individuals with PTEN mutations. So we took a very broad approach to identify if there are any aspects of behavior or neurocognition that could be improved. We also did some objective tests, such as EEG, to see if this drug actually got into the brain and whether we could see the effects of the drug on the brain using an objective measurement such as EEG, a brainwave analysis. This was an early stage phase 1-2 trial. So to get approval for a drug, you have to go through 3 phases up to phase 3. And if the study is successful, then you would get approval. This was an early stage exploratory trial. It was double blind, so we did not know which participant was on which arm of the study. It was a placebo control, so there was a placebo arm and active drug arm. And this was done at 3 centers, as I mentioned, with the primary endpoint being the safety and efficacy of the drug. Here is the structure of the study. Participants were screened and then they were randomized into either the Everolimus arm or the placebo arm. They stayed on this arm for 6 months and in a blinded phase, so we did not know which patient was on what arm, and the patient did not know which arm they were on. And then they finally exited the study, and the patients that were getting placebo were offered a 6-month open label phase for further treatment with the Everolimus, the active drug. I should say that everolimus has been used in both pediatric and adult patients for several years now, and we know its side effects quite well. The main side effect turns out to be optus ulcers that occur in the mucosa of the mouth, and they can cause what's called a stomatitis, or inflammation of the mouth, and that can be irritating to people. It can be treated by topical treatment, and almost always goes away. But it's the most common side effect. Other side effects include increasing cholesterol, increasing triglycerides, and it has mild immunosuppression properties, usually tolerated well. The majority of the adverse side effects due to everolimus are mild to moderate, and this is what we knew about the drug before we started this trial. So we actually published the design of this trial, and the results of the trial are also have been accepted for publication, and should be coming out shortly in Human Molecular Genetics. Here is the design of the trial and how many patients went through it. 46 patients were randomized, 24 into the intervention arm and 22 into the placebo arm. None of the patients were lost to follow up. 2 patients discontinued on the everolimus arm, and 1 patient discontinued on the placebo arm. And we did the analysis on the whole set of 24 patients on the everolimus and whole set of 22 patients on the placebo arm based on intention to treat analysis. So we even took into account the patients who discontinued the intervention. So let me tell you the results on the safety first. There was no difference in dropout in the everolimus arm versus the placebo arm. So in terms of the main safety analysis, there was no difference between the 2 arms. So everolimus seemed to be quite well tolerated. There was a number of adverse events, and many of them were mild, as you can see here. The vast majority were grade 1 or grade 2, which means they were really relatively mild and self-resolved. Vast majority of the events, 83% of those that happened in the everolimus arm, either resolved or recovered without sequelae. So there were definitely more adverse events, as you would expect from the everolimus arm, than the placebo arm. The most common adverse event, when you compare the placebo arm versus the everolimus arm, that seems to be significantly more in the everolimus arm, is these gastrointestinal ulcers that I mentioned to you before. These are just the ulcers that happen around the mouth mucosa, and they happened about 4 or 5 times more commonly in the everolimus arm than the placebo arm. All the other side effects that we saw in the placebo and everolimus were roughly comparable. They were not significantly different from each other, as shown here. So the PTEN experience with everolimus is similar to the experience with other diseases, including tuberous sclerosis. The majority of the adverse events are mild. They did some of the serious events occurred more common in the everolimus group, but they did not change the enrollment in the study. And the GI complaints, primarily the stomatitis, were the most common side effects. So this really confirmed what was known about everolimus in the past, and it I think on a very positive note, it did not show us any new side effects in the PTEN population. Now, what about the second question? Is it effective? Is it efficacious? So we had a primary endpoint just designed for this study, and what we did was to choose aspects of cognition that we thought were particularly affected in PTEN hamartoma tumor syndrome. We looked at things like working memory, speed of processing, and we made a composite measure out of those. And importantly, we did not see an improvement in those primary endpoints in terms of efficacy. However, we did see a large number of components move in the direction of improvement in the other assessments we did. And I'm just showing you a social responsiveness scale, which is a measure of autistic-like behavior, if you will. And we saw that in the placebo group, there was really no improvement during the 6 months, but those treated with everolimus actually showed us a significant improvement during this time. So that improvement was actually statistically significant and was also thought to be clinically meaningful. Another aspect that seemed to improve was the adaptive behavior as measured by a assessment called Vineland, and that also showed improvement. We also asked the question, was there any global improvement in the everolimus group versus the placebo group? And when you look at that question as a yes or no, about nearly 60% of the patients in everolimus group had a positive response, whereas only 30% or so in the placebo arm had a positive response. So there seemed to be a improvement, overall improvement, as measured by global scales here. So to summarize, in terms of efficacy, potentially meaningful efficacy trends were observed for the adaptive behavior measured by Vineland, behavior problems as measured by a tool called CBCL, sensory processing, as well as non-verbal IQ. The CGI, which is the Clinical Global Impression Improvement Subscale, also was suggestive of improvements in those taking everolimus. So our analysis suggests that everolimus is well tolerated in the PHTSF participants, and adverse events were similar to those that were previously reported in previous trials and clinical practice. In terms of efficacy, there might be a clinical benefit with use of everolimus, but this was not statistically significant in the major primary endpoint, but definitely requires further study. Of note, several of the secondary efficacy endpoints moved in the direction of improvement. So we cannot recommend this based on this study alone, but it requires further studies to prove that there's actually a benefit to taking everolimus in terms of behavior and cognition in individuals with PHTS. We also measured the electrophysiological measures such as EEG, and we can show that everolimus was actually improving the EEG in PHTS patients that were taking it for 6 months. So that's an important scientific finding that will allow us to have more informative trials, we hope, in the future, using EEG as a marker of brain activity. So I should end here and acknowledge that we really couldn't have done this study with the generosity and bravery and tenacity of the families and patients in the PTEN clinics across the United States and United Kingdom who participated in this trial. This, I should say, trial was done during COVID, and none of the patients that were enrolled in this trial sought to discontinue their enrollment despite COVID. This, I think, speaks to really the determination and the dedication of individuals and families with PHTS and their amazing tenacity despite the pandemic as a huge obstacle. I also want to thank the sponsors, which is National Institute of Health in the United States, Novartis, and PTEN Research. This required a large group of people working together on analysis and acquisition of this data, and they're all listed here. Thank you for allowing me to share the results of our trial, and I'm sorry I can't be there in person to answer your questions, but if there are any questions, I'd be happy to address them remotely by email. Thank you very much, and enjoy your meeting.